Modelland is a 2011 young adult dystopian science fiction fantasy book by Tyra Banks. That Tyra Banks. I read Modelland years ago as a lark, because, why not? I also read Jay Manuel's The Bitch, The Wig, and The Meltdown, which I may reread again for the hell of it, because given that recent documentary Tyra Banks put out trying to rehab her image and the image of America's Next Top Model, and given the fact that it absolutely crashed and burned and reignited loads of controversy and criticism, I thought it might be worth it to remind everyone that she wrote a very weird young adult novel 15 years ago. It's been so long that I didn't quite remember many details about the plot, but I feel I should mention that I still have my copy of this book, which means I liked it enough to not dump it. So I decided to sit down and give the book another read for the purposes of breaking down the plot for you. So to start off, our main character, 15-year-old Tuki de la Creme. God, we're off to such a rollicking good start, aren't we? Anyway, she lives in a place called Metopia, one of the many countries in this fantasy world. Lording over all of these lands, however, is Modelland. You can almost call it a Mount Olympus type place where girls have the opportunity to become Bellas, models, and develop unique powers of their own. The goal is to become a 7, and the big goal is to become a 777, and then there are the Intoxibellas and the Belladonna, who's like the big boss of Modelland, and listen, there are a lot of words in this book, and I only have a vague sense of what they mean at some points. It makes more sense in context, okay? Anyway, all the girlies want to go to Modelland. It's a whole big obsession thing. It's like Willy Wonka putting out the calls for people to come to the chocolate factory. Tuki is an unpopular, weird-looking forget-a-girl, in her own words, with one friend, an escaped hospital patient named Lizzie, who wants them to run away together. Tuki is down for this because her parents hate her. Her mother, Creamy de la Creme, is an image and doll-obsessed weirdo, and her acrobat father was forced to retire after losing his eye in an accident. And he thinks he isn't actually Tuki's father. Her little sister, 13-year-old Miracle, is a spoiled airhead popular girl who is almost certain to be selected for Modelland this year. Modelland sends out smizes, these, masks, eye covers, something like that. But it's sent out through the water. It's very much a very, like, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory situation where everyone's going mad trying to find them because I think there's only 7 in the world, or 7 per country, I don't know. Tuki ends up pulling one out of the sink, which her parents promptly force her to give to Miracle. I should mention, too, if you're thinking to yourself, like, wow, what's a smize? Why would she call it a smize? If you're not familiar with Tyra Banks, there's a phrase that she would use in America's Next Top Model called a smize, which is when you smile with your eyes. So she clearly coined that term and then put it into this book as kind of a brand recognition thing. So on the day of discovery, when the scouts come out to find girls for Modelland, Tuki is picked by a particular scout over her sister and pulled up to Modelland. The scout also picks up a few other girls who don't quite fit the typical beauty standards and pulls them up too. Dylan, Shiraz, and Piper, whom Tuki bonds with quickly. After getting to Modelland, they also befriend a girl named Kamalini. Together, the girls take classes in the very Hogwartsian, Willy Wonka-ish Modelland, trying to become models whilst also trying to unravel the mysteries behind the Belladonna and the infamous Intoxibella, Ciel, a caramel-skinned, green-eyed... God damn it. Anyway, there's hijinks, there's model stuff, but the big reveal towards the end of the book is that Ciel's best friend died trying to cross the Diabolical Divide, the extremely dangerous no-man's land that separates Modelland from the rest of the world. So while Tuki did end up being on the list of girls that were pre-selected for Modelland, which directly contradicts the idea the day Discovery is a free-for-all, Shiraz, Dylan, and Piper were all taken on a whim because they resembled Ciel's dead friends. Then, Tuki's mother, Creamy, and Miracle show up in Modelland, having managed to successfully cross the Diabolical Divide. It's here that, in a very drawn-out and convenient set of scenes, we learn that not only is the Belladonna Ciel's mother, but Creamy was the Belladonna's best friend in Modelland and betrayed her, which led to the Belladonna giving Ciel up. Long story short, the Belladonna accidentally stabs Creamy and is henceforth deprived of her crown, which is then inherited by Ciel, who vows to make Modelland a better place. Okay, so, that was wild. You may not be able to fully understand just how wild until you sit down and read this book for yourself, but this entire book is very, very, very wild. It's also 570 pages. This was the original overly thick, like, young adult romantasy book. Even though it's not a romantasy, but you get my meaning. So, I don't think I need to say that the book isn't the best written thing ever, right? I don't think it's as badly written as some of the romantasy books that come out to appease the book talk crowd nowadays. Methinks Tyra Banks had an editor to clean things up a little bit, but it's still not super well written. There's a lot of repetition, telling instead of showing. There's a lot of spelling things out for the audience, and the storytelling and lore is kind of all over the place, which I'm going to get into later. I vaguely recall reading a negative review on Goodreads that said something like, I believe Tyra Banks wrote this book because it sounds too much like her. Like, she definitely didn't use a ghostwriter for this because it sounds way too much like her inner voice. And honestly, I agree with that sentiment. I believe that Tyra Banks sat down and wrote this book herself, underdeveloped fiction writing skills and all. However, I would argue that the first 100 pages of this book possess a certain charm. And that charm is based on the fact that there's clearly a heavy amount of humor and satire in it. It was ridiculous, and it very much came across as intentionally so. Have you ever seen Super Jail? It's this surreal, bizarre cartoon that used to be on Adult Swim, very funny and dark and absurd, and also very, very mature, by the way, definitely not for kids. But all I could think of when I started reading Modelland was, this kind of reminds me of Super Jail. The beginning of the book is so weird, and overall it doesn't seem like you're meant to take things super seriously. It's very over the top. I mean, Tuki's mother's full name is Cremalata de la Creme, and her dad lost his eye because Creamy opened her compact mirror during his acrobat performance, which blinded him and caused him to fall. That's some Roger Smith Persona backstory shit right there! Then, on page 68, when the Intoxibellas are kind of showing off their powers and one of them has the ability to shapeshift, there's this one guy near Tuki in the crowd that enthusiastically calls out, and I quote, "If I had her, I could have a different girl every night. I could stop cheating!" Unquote. It's ridiculous, and it's clearly meant to be so I do have to compliment that. The book was funny, offbeat, and interesting right up until Tuki was brought to Modelland. Now, I'm not going to say that the book loses that over-the-top absurdity after that point. It's definitely still there. But I will say that it proceeds to start taking itself too seriously in a very young adult fiction fashion. Had Tyra Banks stuck with the pure ridiculousness throughout the book and written something that winks at you constantly and indicates that you're not really meant to be getting anything from this book but a laugh, I sincerely would have respected it. I think it would have been very good. But once Tuki gets to Modelland, this kind of turns into your stereotypical young adult fare. Tuki and her friends struggle with self-acceptance of their various unique bodies and appearances. Modelland reveals just how unfair beauty standards and the expectations of models are, etc., etc. It goes from being absurd to trying to be deep and serious, and the mood whiplash is enough to break your neck. Tuki herself is a pretty decent character, not the deepest I've ever seen, but it was rather refreshing to read a story where the main character was an actually good person with good priorities and didn't need to have her arm twisted to be kind or do the right thing. I can't tell if this surprise comes from the fact that I've read a lot of horror and other fiction with fucked up characters in it, or if maybe I was just kind of surprised that this particular author does grasp what it means to be a genuinely kind person. On that note, CL. So she's extremely hot, the best model ever, a world-class poet, has 7, I think, powers available to her, caramel skin, green eyes, who is fighting for change in the unfair system that Modelland has set up. I'm not saying she's a Tyra Banks XP. I'm not. I'm just saying I wouldn't be shocked if she isn't, okay? Speaking of the world-class poet thing, let me give you an example of that. For context, this is page 236, and she's referring to Shiraz, Dylan, and Guru Ganero, the teacher of the class, in that order. Quote, "A microscopic lass below the criterion, journey aborted, but soul cannot rest. A Rubenesque damsel surrounded by twigs, her lush carcass devoured, insects infest. Their crony, elected exemplar of excellence, has failed them, whose soul demons now do possess." Unquote. Okay. I don't know if it'll be out by the time this video is, but I recently read another book where the author tried her hand at writing deep and meaningful poetry, and, in my opinion, failed very badly. I'll say what I said, and or will be saying in that review. If you are not a poet, if you are not someone who has experience with that genre of writing, it is best to approach it with caution. Poetry is very, very easy to screw up and inadvertently turn into an "I'm 14 and this is deep" post, and CL's poetry here is very slam poetry, "I'm 14 and this is deep" edition. While I'm still on the topic of CL, I should probably tell you what her name stands for. Stands for, Jenny? Comes the humble audio listener. What do you mean? Well, what I mean is that CL's name is spelled with a C, as in Charlie, I, as in India, then there's a little tilde, that little squiggly line on your keyboard, and then L, as in Lima. Throughout this book, I assume that CL's name was one that she took on voluntarily upon becoming a model, or maybe it was a name assigned to her in Modelland. But nope. It was bestowed upon her by her belladonna mother, the woman who spent the entire novel tormenting and punishing her, by the way, and it means sea love. Tyra. Girly. Anyway. I touched on Tukey before, but she's more or less your standard young adult heroine. She's an ugly duckling that realizes she's actually uniquely beautiful. Her journey is mostly one of self-acceptance and realizing her own self-worth. Perfectly nice, inoffensive, but not a character that would really stand out in the genre. Dylan, Shiraz, and Piper, on the other hand, are fairly one-note. Shiraz is super perky and very small. She might have dwarfism, but I can't remember. Piper has albinism and is super into technology, if I recall correctly, and Dylan is a big girl who actually has a disorder that involves taking in a lot of food and then yakking up that food again, if you get what I'm implying, because YouTube apparently freaks out if you even say the disorder's name. There were a set of quadruplets in the story that had the other very familiar disorder that involves food, which is the one where you don't eat. The messaging was a bit confusing in that respect. So initially the girls' take was effectively a nutrition class. Dylan is called out for eating too much, and the likey quadruplets are called out for eating too little, which, okay, reasonable. Dylan is overweight and the likey sisters are underweight. The point seems to very reasonably be that neither is healthy and they need to work to overcome their issues with food. I really need to stress here that this was not framed as Dylan is fat, shame on her, but rather that her relationship with food is unhealthy. Guru Laro, the professor of the class, explicitly says, and I quote, "I'm also picking up that food has an emotional effect on you," unquote. At no point does she make any remarks on Dylan's body, and this comes on the heels of her addressing the Likey sisters for not eating enough and stressing the need for them to take in enough nutrients to be healthy. For 2011, it was actually a pretty level-headed and reasonable message on, as YouTube would apparently prefer that I say it, mental health issues involving food. But then, later on, CL remarks that Dylan has a big, beautiful body and there's nothing wrong with her, and you'll recall from earlier in that slam poetry bit that she referred to Dylan as a Rubenesque beauty surrounded by twigs, which is, okay, CL is the rebel and the truth teller of this novel. Conveniently. Whatever comes out of her mouth seems to be gospel, and Modelland is notoriously fucked up and also an allegory for real-life issues within the modeling industry. So there are two conclusions that I could reach. A, Guru Laurel's advice to Dylan was bad and inherently shaming, even though it addressed her having an eating disorder involving food intake. Or B, Tyra Banks casually forgot that she wrote that bit about Dylan being disordered with her food intake and wanted to include body positivity into the book, especially since, if I recall correctly, I think Tyra Banks herself was shamed for having a fuller figure when she started modeling. Personally, I lean towards B. As I said before, the bit with Guru Laurel was very level-headed. Undereating is unhealthy and so is overeating. The focus is very much on health and balance. And also we find out, literally straight from Dylan's mouth, that she engages, again, in eating loads of food and then yakking that food up. You know, I'm honestly kind of okay with YouTube banning kids if that means we get to stop tiptoeing around actual clinical terminology when discussing serious topics. I'm okay with that. Fuck them kids. Just let me swear to my heart's content and use straightforward grown-up words without getting dinged, please. Anyway, the two messages contradict one another. You cannot tell me that Dylan is a gorgeous Rubenesque beauty surrounded by twigs, which is also kind of a nasty thing to say about the other girls, and then tell me that her figure is the result of food-related mental disorder. Because it comes off like you're complimenting or excusing disordered behavior with eating. And as before, I don't think that was Tyra's intention. I don't know if she threw the disorder in on a whim or what, maybe to counterbalance the subject of the Likey sisters having the not eating food issue, but I don't think she thought through the implications of giving Dylan this particular mental health problem and then complimenting her figure. So as it happens, Dylan, Shiraz, and Piper all disappear after the Belladonna is revealed as CL's mother, basically. Despite their inclusion in Modelland being meant as this big rebellion and the fact that they are some of the first and only friends Tukey's had, we get no real closeout with them at the end. You know, I almost said that they were Tukey's first and only friends, but then I remembered Lizzie existed. And I swear it's been almost a decade since I first read this thing, and maybe I was mixing it up with another book, but I thought Lizzie was meant to be tied into Modelland some way, like her repeatedly breaking out of the mental hospitals was actually because she was a model who'd rebelled or something to that effect. And then upon reading the book again, I was hit with the reality that nope, actually, Lizzie barely factors into the story at all. No narrative purpose except giving Tukey a reason to not actually want to be at the day of discovery. Speaking of someone who didn't serve all that much of a narrative purpose, Tukey's love interest, Bravo. They had no chemistry with one another that I could see. He basically served to be the hot boy who happens to be dead-ass madly in love with the odd-looking girl that no one else bats an eye at. It's the One Direction song, What Makes You Beautiful, in boy form. He had one narrative purpose aside from that, and it was basically giving the girls the means to escape Modelland at one point. The lore of the world was all over the place. Again, so much of this book is absurd. The nature of Modelland is an exaggerated depiction of what it's like to be a model, and the world at large's obsession with Modelland reflects an almost religious devotion to the beauty and fashion industry. It's all, again, very over the top for the sake of parody and satire. I don't think it was Tyra's intention to create a fleshed-out fantasy novel, but rather to write an exaggerated version of what she already knows. So the lore is neither deep nor comprehensive, doesn't tie together super well, but that kind of works for this novel. We know what we need to know to keep the plot moving. That being said, the storytelling is all over the place and full of loose ends. Again, Dylan, Shiraz, and Piper disappear at the end of the book. Lizzie is there, but doesn't ultimately serve that deep of a purpose. The subplot of Tukey's father thinking that she isn't really his kid, nothing comes of that. There was a brief moment where it seemed like a monster from Piper's homeland might pose a threat to Modelland, but nothing came of that either. There was a brief exploration of the inhabitants of Modelland, a lot of whom have these kind of peculiar mutations and odd things, like all the nurses have skates on their feet, and so they all have to be nurses and stuff like that. Sincerely, I don't know if this is just Tyra forgetting that she set up these plot points and this kind of exploration into the logic of Modelland and people being pigeonholed into certain careers because of their appearance or something, or if maybe she intended to write a second novel and just never got around to it, but it was never really deeply explored. It seemed like an interesting subplot that was never followed up on. Overall, I think that Modelland had an interesting premise that was pretty in line with a lot of the dystopian books coming out in the early to mid-2010s after Hunger Games, The Maze Runner, and Uglies kind of lit a fire under the genre. It's a goofy Willy Wonka Hogwarts America's Next Top Model mashup, and you might enjoy it if you're into that sort of thing. Just be aware that it is a young adult novel, and while it starts off being pretty funny and over the top, it falls into the trap of wanting to be taken quite seriously towards the middle and end. If you can believe it, it's actually not the worst book from the America's Next Top Model cast I've ever read. I'm actually considering rereading and reviewing J. Manuel's The Bitch, the Wig, and the Meltdown and doing a review on it, because it was certainly a book and not nearly as funny as Modelland. But I don't know. I might not. Anyway, thanks for watching and have a lovely night.